Your journey operating model is either a growth engine or a silent blocker. One global staffing firm discovered they were solving the same problem 6 different ways across regions. Quite zero alignment on who owned what. It's not a tooling issue, that's a governance issue. And let's face it, in an enterprise organization, there is a level of governance needed to coordinate large groups of people. But it doesn't have to be a time drag. When applied right, it creates leverage and, most importantly, relief. So the best governance models are implemented and not necessarily referred to. I know it can sound very long and time-consuming to build and create this, but I want to make it simple. In this video, I'm going to break down 4 real-world governance models for journey management, from central command to full autonomous model, and show you which one unlocks coordination at scale without slowing teams down. I'm from TheyDo, where we help organizations run customer journeys as a system, not just as a set of disconnected initiatives. And this is what we've learned over the last 5 years. I have a front row seat in 50, 60 of the Fortune 500 right now. And what I'm seeing is the way you set up journey management matters just as much as the tools you use. So let's decode the models that either scale or stall your efforts to make customer centricity common across all these different teams in different parts of the organization, different parts of the world. Because without a clear governance models, teams default to what they know and what they think is best. Marketing runs a journey sprint, which is kind of like funnel meets customer centricity. Product is mapping flows, ops is building blueprints from scratch. And everyone is talking about the journey as if they're the same thing. No one's aligned, and everyone thinks they're solving the same problem or the correct problem and being customer-centric, okay? Multiply that across geos, segments, product lines, and you're burning money, time, and credibility. What I'm seeing, teams waste up to a third of their week duplicating work and decoding the work of others, basically retranslating or taking what they've created and turning that into something they can actually understand themselves. Project delayed by months, waiting for centralized approval, inconsistent standards, eroding customer trust. And I mean, if you are an NPS forward organization, you will probably see that's still wobbly. This isn't a customer experience problem. I'm going to show you that it's an operating model failure. But in customer centricity, journeys and data are typically all over the place. So we want to centralize, and that makes sense. And we want to create an efficient approach to journey management. And that's where I'm seeing most organizations start, having fully baked centralized control, governance, and ownership. But that's just one way of doing it. So I'm going to break down the operating models using a simple 2x2. And there are really 2 big questions to answer. And from there, all nuanced details will follow. So on one axis, we're going to answer, who owns the journeys? Is it centralized or is it completely distributed? And on the horizontal axis, we can understand like who governs the journey framework, the data model. Is that central or is it distributed or is it mixed? This gives us 4 distinct models, which I'll break down in this video. So one is the orchestrated model, which is central command. Then we have the hub and spoke model, which is like a franchise model. Then we get to more of a federated excellence model, which, I mean, Spotify model is one of the common ways to think about it by analogy. And then we have a full autonomy model, completely independent units. So I want to break them down a little bit with the pros and cons of each, okay? So let's start with where most organizations actually start. The global customer experience team is asked to create a better way of delivering outcomes for customers and business. And they think, okay, great, let's have a centralized governance model. Who owns the data? How do we structure things? How do we map every little piece of the experience back to something that we can all agree on? But also ownership is centralized. So central teams own all the customer journeys. And in that example of the global staffing firm, it basically means like we have a best practice. Now you're going to implement that in your market. And that's how we run things. Execution teams get read-only access. There's very, very clear governance, but the downside is it creates bottlenecks. I mean, some organizations can debate endlessly, how do we name these things? How do we name our personas? How do we actually give the right people the right rights to help impact that? And they can spend months on debating that and nothing actually moves. So the problem with this centralized approach is that it gives too much control to the central team and creates a bottleneck in actually helping work execute. Well, if we go down and think about the governance is being centralized on the data model, the structure, but ownership is distributed. So that basically means there's a central coordination layer that says, hey, we have a unified journey framework. If you're in a bank, for instance, we have a customer lifecycle model. And then for the different business lines like mortgages, loans, we have different journey frameworks. That's typically created and managed by the central team. But then if we think about the teams below that, the enabling teams, but also the journey-centric teams in those organizations, like getting a mortgage and understanding the steps between that, that's basically giving control and ownership to distributed teams, to people in organizations that actually have the domain expertise. And that can equally be a product line or a different country that is doing it in their way. Then distributing the ownership of the metrics, the data, of the decisions, of the coordination within that realm of the business is actually handed over to a domain team that can execute. So we call that the hub and spoke model. Now, if we think about the other end of the spectrum, distributed governance and distributed teams, we'll go into a full autonomy model. There's complete independence. And this is actually like where a lot of organizations that don't have this in place actually are, because journeys are all over the place, blueprints are all over the place, data is all over the place, reporting is all over the place. Literally everyone is thinking they're working customer-centric, but nothing is aligned. So maybe the organization says we want to be customer-centric, we want to be journey-centric, and then every team needs to find a way to adhere to that. So there is at least a strategic direction, but in reality, everyone can basically do what they want, which is great if you have a very mature customer experience, customer forward, customer obsessed organization. But in most organizations, that's too fragmented, and that leads to all these like problems of no coordination. And basically, you're back to square one. Think about it. If you would solve that with tools, you're going to have better control over the outputs, but there's no coordination whatsoever. Now, there is, if we move a little bit back, there is a federated excellence model that we're seeing where domain teams own their journeys, and there is less of a centralized control over the framework. So, for instance, if you're in a financial institution and mortgages is split from loans, and there's a commercial team that takes care of businesses, it might be that each of them is doing it completely different, but they're all having some form of consistency within their domain. Now, the central team that's typically in place is coaching. They are sharing best practices. They're supporting. A lot of CX functions in financial institutions were like that, where there's a central team that didn't have control, but they were responsible for evangelizing, creating, and supporting all the teams that were building to be customer-centric, teaching them design thinking, journey mapping, enabling them with the customer-centric toolkit, which creates high autonomy and emergent standards. But the problem is that requires mature teams and some level of consistency that needs to be there in the business already. And typically, what you will see is then some organizations and some parts of the organizations drift off because they're not mature and go back to doing it process-centric or not customer-centric. And other teams are thriving because they're closer to the customer. And then the whole balance is not in place. And therefore, ultimately, the customer experience suffers. So these are basically the 4 different models that I'm seeing. And they all depend on different influences in the organization. But as you can tell by the way I am explaining this, there is a starting point that is pretty centralized, and then it moves into more of a distributed model. Now, the question is, are you going to hand over distributed ownership to the journey in the organization, people responsible for part of the customer experience? Or do you actually give control over the framework and the data model into the different parts of your organization as well? By analogy, I mean, if you've been part of building a BI function or been part of the architecture underpinning that, this should feel similar, right? Your journey framework is like your data warehouse. You can have multiple, but like that setup is a shared foundation everyone pulls from. And your L1, L2 journeys, like the more granular versions of the customer experience, are like data marts, domain-specific views tailored for action. Just like in BI, governance is what keeps things consistent, relevant, and scalable. And without it, you get the CX equivalent of a spreadsheet chaos, duplicated journey, silo fixes, no shared truth. So this is how they map in my mind. So you have the central model, the orchestrated model, right? It's like a monolithic warehouse. There's just one central control over that and a team that is able to help answer specific questions and analyze the data. Now, the hub and spoke model is more of there's a centralized warehouse, and then there's all these different data marts, and there's different teams creating them and owning that data and making sure that it's available for the relevant stakeholders. Then we have the federated model, the Spotify model, where self-serve BI is available to everyone and there's some coaching on best practices, but everyone is on their own to figure it out. And then we have the full autonomy, which is Excel hell, and there's a lot of shadow IT necessary to get that up. So definitely not recommend that. But that's how basically they map. If your BI team wouldn't run without standards and shared systems, why should your journey management practice? I think to exemplify the shift from central command to franchise, journey ownership moves closer to the teams doing the work. Okay, and it's just as much as moving it to the hub and spoke models to the friendship. And I think that's great because then they have ownership over what they measure, how they want to prioritize, and then the enabling teams that they work with can also tie their roadmaps and delivery to the journeys. But the data rolls up to the bigger picture, so there can always be a level of reporting and understanding at the organization level so that the different stakeholders in the executive teams can stay aligned. The good thing is the central team stops to be a bottleneck in approvals and making sure that the journeys are vetted and things are moving in the right way. What we're seeing is then your journey management becomes the system of record, and there's shared visibility and standards across, let's say, different teams in different geos, different product lines. But because everything stays connected, there are schemas and ways that the data remains comparable. And that's exactly what you want to achieve, because if you want the organization to all move with the same direction in a great velocity, then there needs to be some centralization of the data around a notion of a customer journey framework that actually can bubble up information. There is greater reuse of journey insights. There is less rework. There is less translation necessary to do things because everyone can find where do they impact the bigger picture for the customer and for the business, but also which parts of the journeys are before or after where they sit or what's above them. So the context matters a lot. Typically, we're seeing 50 to 60% faster delivery when there is more autonomy in the teams, but they're all still connected to the bigger whole. So here's the truth. Your journey framework model is your operating system. It shapes how fast you move, how well you align, and how much value you actually deliver to your customers. So mapping your model is basically asking the questions: who owns what, who decides, and ultimately who governs? And just as important, when do these moments happen? But that's maybe something for the next one, because if you're serious about journey management, you need more than tools. You need a model that scales and maps onto your organization. So if you want to shift from chaos to coordination, I hope these 4 models are helpful to really start defining the operating rules that your organization can start with and evolve